After the Last Dog Died is the story of Douglas Mawson. He was a scientist who wanted to discover the magnetic South Pole. As you know, there are longitude and latitude lines which tell us where the North Pole and the South Pole are, but being a scientist, he knew that the Earth is a magnet. Therefore, the South Pole and the North Pole actually move on the axis, and they move because the magma inside of the Earth is moving. He wanted to find that location of the magnetic South Pole. So he brought together a huge crew of scientists. He brought together dogs so that they could go out and find that magnetic South Pole. They brought tools. What they didn't expect was that they ran into terrible weather, blizzard conditions. Once they did set out, they discovered that there were crevices in the ice, and some of those crevices were 2 miles deep. Several people in his team ended up going over an edge, and they could not rescue him. Several people died during this expedition, not just from the crevices, other reasons as well. And you have to read this book in order to discover what happened to them. You're never going to believe it. One of my favorite books of all time. This is the story of Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley was very famous in her time. She was the equivalent of a movie star. She was a participant in Wild Bill's Wild Wild West show, where she was a sharpshooter. She could shoot a bullseye with a gun, riding on the back of a galloping horse, not sitting on that horse, but standing on that galloping horse. She could still hit her bullseye. She was so famous that the Queen of England sent for her. Back then, at the time that people were settling the West, she traveled with Wild Bill's Wild Wild West show, and people came from all over just to see her shoot. She was truly an amazing woman. This is the Emperor's Silent Army. Back in the 1970s, there were 3 farmers who wanted to expand their farm. And so they went looking for underground water so that they could build a well to feed their new farm. And what they actually discovered as they were digging, looking for a well, was they discovered these terracotta soldiers. These soldiers were made out of clay, and then they were fired and glazed so that they would harden, and they were painted, and there were thousands upon thousands of them, and they all had their own face. They were put there by an ancient emperor who was very fearful of the afterlife. He was sure that he would come back to life after he died, so he protected himself with this army in his tomb. Today, his tomb is still being uncovered. His army is still being uncovered 30 years later. It is quite a treasure of ancient China. Ain't nothing but a man. This is the story of the real John Henry. Most of you have heard of the tall tale of John Henry, the man who was stronger than the machine, and he could bust through the rock faster than a machine. Well, how much of that is true and how much of that is a tall tale? That's what Scott Nelson decided to uncover as he researched the real John Henry. The real John Henry ended up in prison after the Civil War. Now, it doesn't mean that he did anything wrong. It wasn't unusual for African American men to be accused of a crime that they didn't commit, because so many of the whites were afraid of a lot of African American men who were now free from slavery. So he wasn't necessarily a bad person, but he was in prison. And there were a whole bunch of men in prison. And what they did every day was they worked on the railroad. What Scott Nelson found was that John Henry truly was as strong as the tall tale says. And he really did work alongside a machine, and he did win. And then he laid down and died, just like the tall tale said. They believe he probably had a heart attack. There's a lot more to this story. Very interesting story about the life of the real John Henry. This is the story of the H.L. Hunley. The H.L. Hunley had been lost at sea for over 130 years. This was one of the very first submarines ever built, and it was used during the Civil War. It was a Confederate sub, and it was lost during a battle. Now, what the researchers don't know is if it was actually hit during that battle and sunk, or if the crew had gone underwater to escape the battle. And that's what people have been trying to find out for a long time. And they've also been looking for it for those 130 years because they know that soldiers were on board that submarine. And so therefore, it's a grave site. It's a burial site as well. Now, we haven't had the technology until recently with sonar to be able to find it. So it was found just recently. A number of scientists have been trying to figure out if the Hunley should be recovered from the Atlantic Ocean. A lot of people say that because it's been in that salt water for so long, and if they were to try to lift it out of the ocean, that the metal would be rust and it would fall apart. They came up with a plan on how to raise it from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. You've got to read this to find out how they recovered it and if they found those soldiers on board.